possibilities to connection or to linking in the Protocol of Palermo with the Paris Agreement about the climate change, because it's inside of our nation, especially in the United Nations, study and research more about the implication between those legal instruments, even with the protocol and the convention about the refugees, because now we are talking about the climate refugees as well. So we can link it in three different legal instrument, international legal instrument, that they create a progressive development of our laws and our legal framework. Let me change. In our agenda today, we will be three topics. We'll have three topics. The first is migration, an overview in the international status of the migration, how many migrants are, and in the global, and what is the principal challenges of the migration. The second is the human trafficking in the global context. And with those two topics, we will start to link in with climate change, and how is the climate change affect two of them. And the third is the interrelations between them, no? Between the migration and the human trafficking, and how they connected. And the four are some next steps. And I think I bring to you some examples about advocacy, about the actions, about the implementation of change in our society, of change in our communities, and even change in our international community, and how the international community can talk and do something different about this issue. First, migration. We will talk about the concept, global data, and resources and the new challenges. For a start, the migration can be defined. It's important. It's not a unique or only one definition about the migration. You have a lot of definition, but some definition that is really common usage is an umbrella term. It's not defined under international law. This is very important because we don't have an international legal instrument to define the migration. And it's reflecting the common law understand of a person who moved away from his or her place of usual residence, whether within a country or across the international border. So that define a people who move for the residence, or the usual residence, the usual domicile, and they cross the border, or they can choose another city inside of her country or his country. So, and these movements can be temporarily or permanently, and is for a variety of different reasons to move. And those different reasons you can explore the climate change, like the one of the last reasons that the people express, that okay, I moved to my usual house, to my usual place or residence, because the effects of the climate change in my community. So we will talk, or we will talk more about that in a few minutes. And it's important, before we pass the another things, that the challenge or opportunities, especially now when we listen a lot of speeches, positive and negative, across the migration. They use some of our communities in our countries. They use the migration like a trending topic in the political campaigns, or the public policy, or even to talk about the budgets or to talk about the public money. So it's important to understand that in our nature and in our history, like a human race, we are we are migrants and we was migrants and we were migrants. So this is important to understand that it's inside of our nature, change, move, and looking a better place to create new spaces for us. And it's an opportunity for some countries, and we will see in some examples that they use a good, they have a good incomes and a good impacts inside of the community in terms of innovations, in terms of the interculturality, or in terms of the interactions based in migration. So it's really important to understand that it's an opportunity and it's not a problem to resolve, a problem to attend, a problem for the only the politician, and the politician can be save us to this problem. So it's important to understand the two sides of the same coin and understand and maybe take a position for an opportunity and the migration and not the other sides. This is the numbers of the migrants in the world. This is the last report of the World Migration Report. It's an interactive report. I recommend and strong recommend that you can check it. You can verify this. You can skim at least this report because it's wonderful and they explain a lot about where are these people, why they migrate, why they move, and they explain our reality and what is our global number of people who is migrant. When we talk about the migration, we think only, oh, maybe it's 10 or thousands, and it's a millions. It's 281 million of people who move in our planet. So it's important to understand as well that you have a migration and climate change, and you have a good relation between that. I don't in this conversation and this talk, I will only focus on the climate change and the migration, climate change like a reason for migrants. No, and you must do. Let's talk about the facts. And the facts, you have environmental transformation, and those environmental transformation can be intensification of the ecological negative human activity in our society. In terms of the overconsumption or overproduction leading to unsustainable economic growth. What happened with that? The depletion of biodiversity collapse and ongoing of the climate change is changed, and the role it under the heading of the human supremacy. There is growing recognition of the extremely negative consequence of human activities. They are not preserving the planet ecological systems. In the several key areas, analysis and reports, we have now in the breaking point to get a chance to have a chance to change our destiny or our future and protect the biodiversity before that collapse. We are in front of the mass extinctions of thousands of species, and we have record levels of population and altering ecosystem in the global. And we have examples. I bring examples for each continent or region in our global to that they have problems with climate change and human trafficking and migration. And what, in terms of human beings, what happened with those change? The extreme weather events are significant triggers in terms of displacement people. And what happened with those people? They change, or they turn to internal and international migration. So they pass to be internal displacement to become in an international migrant. So, in face of displacement from their countries and their communities, they're forced to go outside and to move to another country, another community for those reasons. Experience displacements as a result of acute disaster events. And we have a lot of information, a lot of examples about those disasters, like hurricanes, like cyclones, like floodings. So understanding talking action and the climate change impact and the migration issue is important now. How the migration policy can play a role in responding to challenge and saving life. And I will focus on the saving life in this presentation in terms of the humanitarian action in the migration policy and how we can change the reasons, but moreover, we can change our public policy to attend and to support more victims of climate change and human trafficking in the world. Links between environmental change, ecosystem, and human mobility. Um, as you can see, you can see the major environmental events and process and how that environmental events can be effect for mobility drivers. In other words, how those environmental events can be affecting ecosystem, and those ecosystem, those consequences can be the reason for those migrants move to another community, looking the mobility drivers looking so some conditions that they find in other communities, in other countries, in other cities. So you can see, for example, food security is one of the principal matters that they looking in other communities: water security, economic security, personal and political security as well, energy security, and global environment. So you have a lot of reasons that they can use, they can find, they can look in other communities. And in the other hands, you have the environmental events like hydrological hazards, geophysical hazards like earthquakes, tsunamis, volcanoes, flooding, landslides, extreme temperatures, even heat wave storms, droughts, forest fires, industrial accidents. So a lot of pollution. So sea level rise is an incredible cause for migration in these days. So this is a chart that you can use for understand in terms of the general information, in terms of our challenge, what is the topic here. Can this yes, can be yes, Simon, can be share this PowerPoint. In terms of the infrastructure, in terms of the policymakers, we can change and we can have a new sense making in our public policy to choose the better options for the migration and the migration policy and the climate policy and the human trafficking policy as well. Let's forward for internal displacement. In internal displacements, you have this chart And this chart they show us all the people who displaced inside of their countries. They don't cross the international borders in their countries, and they are increased between 2012 to 2021. And you have in orange the conflict and violence, in blue the disasters. And how since 2019 are increased the numbers of the internal displacement for disasters, moves for disasters, 5.1 million, 7 million, 5.9 millions. You have these new trendy, new trendy for the new flows, for the migration, for the internal displacement, for those who was moving, who was forced for disasters. And those disasters are included the climate change, like a reason for those disasters, like a flooding or earthquakes or cyclones or even volcanoes. So the conflict, violence, and disaster triggered 38 millions of internal displacements across 141 countries and territories in 2021, the second highest annual figure in a decade after 2022, record-breaking year for disaster displacement. But in other hands, the conflict and violence triggered 14.4 million of movements, an increase almost 50% of the year before. So we have a new discover about the disasters and the migration, forced migration in the internal displacement inside of the countries for the effects and the impacts of the climate change here. And this chart you can see the entire world and how with the orange, the orange, you can see the internal displacement for conflicts. And with the blue, you can see the internal displacement for by disasters. And those disasters are included all the consequences for the climate change, and are included all these environmental events that we talking before. So you can see in each country, in each region, how the blue is a majority, and how the orange is a minority, and how the orange can be concentrated in some areas, in some regions, more than others. If you have any question, you can do it the chat, or you can do it the others, or you can talk. So after those data, those numbers, we can talk more about the human trafficking, and how I can explain how I mentioned in the beginning of this presentation. The Palermo Protocol was the legal instrument, the legal international instrument who has the international responsibility of our states, of the member state of this protocol, to acting. They has a definition, a common definition about the human trafficking, and what is the different crimes related to the human trafficking, with 3 additional protocols up to the Palermo. But moreover of that, you have the international responsibility to create and to develop better policies to acting, better policies to implement that protocol, better policies to support victims and go behind the reasons and prosecute the reasons. And one of the reasons related to human trafficking that is show us in, especially with the pandemic COVID-19, was the climate change is a multiplicator of all the factors and the risk of the human trafficking. And it's important to understand that the movement under the climate change impact is a movement who is more exposed to be victim, to become in a victim of human trafficking, especially women and especially childs and girls. So it's important to understand those those scenarios in the new challenge of the world, in the new challenge to our world after the pandemic or post-pandemic, to understand our role in the society. I bring you the message for Wada Wali, Executive Director to the United Nations Offices for Drugs and Crimes, and by the global report of the UNODC in the human trafficking as law enforcement and public services were under increasing strain. Pandemic restrictions may have also driven some forms of trafficking to more hidden locations, potentially increasing the dangers to victims and making it less likely they could come to attention of the authorities. Overall, there is a little evidence to suggest that the threat of the crime has diminished with the drop in detected victims and many reasons to fear that the COVID crisis, conflict, and climate emergency are scaling trafficking risk. So it's really important to understand our role in the climate change and the human trafficking, especially like a reason to increase the human trafficking victims for those movements, in the climate change situations, no? And we can talk more about the victims versus cases and numbers versus numbers and clues, because we have a numbers of victims and a few numbers of cases. In victims, we have a lot of thousands of victims per region and per country, but in cases in the judiciary system, we have a few cases. So this is the first challenge in the human trafficking efforts, because we have better laws, we have a good legal frame, but we don't have a lot of prosecution for our cases. But in our daily routine, we find a lot of victims. We support a lot of victims, but the numbers between the victims and the cases is not proportional. It's not increased proportional. The victims is increased, and the cases prosecuted by the government is decreased. So let me show you this as a new is the global report of trafficking in person from UNODC. The UNODC is the United Nations Offices for Drugs and Crimes, and they understand that the trend in the number of detected victims for 100 population, 100,000 population comparison for 2019 to 2020 by sex. And you can see in North America, the females and male victims detected increasing 40% and 26%. But in Central America and the Caribbean and South America is totally different. No, you can see in South America minus 38% and 23% minus in South America for males and for females. It's the same in Central America and the Caribbean, 67% less and 60% less. So in terms of the global, we have the diminution, the decrease in 27% of the prosecution of the detected victims. And we have in Central America the 54% of production in Central America and the Caribbean, and the South America the 46% in globally, in those terms. So it's important to understand and how the victims versus the cases are in different roads. In those different roads, we can talk in more inequality, injustice, precarious life, and precarious and precarious communities, no, for those victims. Let's talk about more how's the perception for those victims, how they conceive themselves. And most victims are self-rescues. And this is an impact sentences in the last report, because the victims needs to self-rescue. They don't trust in the government, so they don't have hope in any of the community response or any kind of help. They help themselves to self-rescue, to go outside to those human trafficking situations, human trafficking crime. It's important to understand that they manage to escape and reach out to the authorities on their own initiative. Fever cases are initiated by the law enforcement, member of the community, and civil society. This is an alarming result, considering many victims of human trafficking may not identify themselves like a victims. So they need to rescue themselves and start to the process to change the self-identity, the self perception, to become and to create, to build a perception that people was a victim, and after that they understand the situation, the victim situation of human trafficking, they cross the line to become a survivor of human trafficking. So you have two different processes inside of the same person in a few time, in a few days, that they need to change the perception of themselves. So we have now the conviction strengths by region, and it's the cases that they saw the cases in this report of the UNODC. They have the cases for each region. In South Asia, you can see the 56% less convictions cases, and in sub-Saharan Africa you have 22% or more cases, conviction cases. And these numbers are the global numbers, the 27% of the reduction of the globally conviction cases. And that means that we have more impunity, we have more injustice and equality in terms of the access of the justice, especially for those victims of human trafficking. So it's important to understand those numbers and those realities before we can talk. We can start talk about the interrelation between migration and interrelation between climate change. And for that reason, I show you, or I bring today the declaration for Carrie Johnstone. She's the US State Department Trafficking in Persons report. And I urge, she mentioned in that report that I urge you to look closely at the special interest boxes that the highlights forced labor and the transition to clean energy, how the climate crisis increased the trafficking risk of the people everywhere. In those terms, we have two difference between two different ways how they can show the effects of human trafficking, the climate change and the human trafficking. And the first is when you have the climate change is the multiplying trafficking risk, and is increasing vulnerability to trafficking in person by acting as a stress multiplier. In 2021, the 23.5 million of people were internally displaced by disasters, while many crossed borders to escape climate-induced poverty, while a system anti-global analysis of the impact of climate change or trafficking in person is missing. Community-level studies in different parts of the world point out weather-inducing disaster as a root cause of trafficking in person. You have crop loss, and if you have a lot of crop loss, the economic vulnerability to trafficking in person is increased. Why is increased? Because the people lost all the ways to bring money to their communities, they bring money to the families, and they need to move to another region, no? As a region of the world become increasingly inevitable, no? People on the move will face high risk of exploitation along the migration routes. Call force an estimated to 260 million of people to migrate within their own countries by 2050. And this is a part of the report of the Global Human Trafficking Report. And it's important to understand that if we have environmental events related with the weather or induced disaster, the climate-induced migration vulnerable to trafficking. So they're directly related and is proportionally increased in the last years because all these movements in vulnerable conditions, especially after the disasters or after the crop loss or the change in our agriculture path, there increase the victims of human trafficking. There increase the potential scenarios to the predators can be recruit new people and new victims in those scenarios. So it's important understanding the impact of the climate change on the human trafficking in person still require comprehension. Since research and examples or inducing natural disaster can expose community relays on fishing, farming, and agriculture to higher risk of trafficking. We have a few examples of that, and the first is in Philippines. When in Philippines we have a typhoons in Philippines case of human trafficking in person increased since 2013 after the Highland typhoons struck the Philippines, causing approximately 6,300 deaths and displacing 4 million of people. The Eastern Visayas region was particularly affected. Those migrants working and employed in the area were already living on the poverty line. Many of the agriculture and fishing industries, which employed the most vulnerable segment of the society, were destroyed, and an estimated of 21,000 families lost their livelihoods due to the damage. Between 2013 and 2015, national authorities recorded about the 6,000 cases of human trafficking in person in the region affected by the typhoon alone. And the key informant of the government and NGO reporting those cases are increased after the disaster. So you have a direct consequence in the internal human trafficking and internal displacements after that an environmental event in Philippines, for example. But we have a Bangladesh as well. And the cyclones and the storms in Bangladesh has been a common detected in Sundarban human trafficking in person cases, the world's largest continuous mangrove forest situated in the border between India and Bangladesh. It's considered a hotspot for the climate change related catastrophe. Damage to the property and crops, fouleries during frequent floods and cyclones has been pushing the largest section of the population. The 43% below the national poverty line in 2014. Forced and development labor has been documented in fisheries areas and the factories in the region, which often employ children as part of their works. The prevalence of these exploited practices show the traffickers take advantage of the economic needs to the population who struggle to cope with the reduced access to the incomes generating activities. That is in Bangladesh. And we have Ghana as well. In Ghana, for example, one of the floods in Ghana are forcing many to migrants with cases of human trafficking of children to forced marriage or labor exploitation being increased documents. In those reports of the UNODC, the human trafficking have been associated with the migratory movement, with the flows of men and boys who relocated from north or central or southern parts of Ghana to find employment of farms or mines or combinations with labor-intensive and unregulated industries. So you have vulnerable conditions for those who needs to go outside after the disaster in those three countries. But moreover, we have in our region, well, I am in USA now, in our region, we have a lot of examples about the hurricanes and rising sea levels in the Caribbean island and how the geographical location of the Caribbean island en route from South and North America together with loss of employment opportunities due to intense tropical storms and cyclones. Rising sea levels and biodiversity degradation expose coast community to risk of being trafficking or engaging in the trafficking activities. So it's really important. Even in the Caribbean, they have different protocols to respond in a disaster situation, in an environmental disaster situation. Moreover, the human trafficking networkings start to operate in those scenarios. And the population affected for the disaster are the potential victims for those the predators. So it's really important, but because you have a three different areas, three different point of our world when I show you examples between human trafficking, climate change, and the forced migration, and is related to those crimes and to those violations of human rights. And let's talk about the next steps. In those next steps, I want to show you some activities, no? How they can define or how can be implementing or do advocacy for change our society. The first is the European Parliament, and the European Commission recognized the climate change as a factor in the migration and the instability, conflict and food security. The climate change factor has been acknowledged several times by the European Commission and the Parliament as a trigger to migration. Even when the UA has not so far recognized climate change refugee formally, it has expressed growing concern and has taken action to support their countries potentially affected by climate-related stress and help them to develop resilience. So they talk about that since a few years, and they in the European Parliament they are talking about the creation and the new level and the new concept of the climate refugees, and maybe in impact in or change in the protocol and the conventions, and maybe talk or discuss in the international community about the change and the inclusion, the addition about the climate refugees like another level in the protocol and the convention of refugees. And this is important in terms of the support of victims of climate change and victims and potential victims of human trafficking and thus in those forced migration for climate change. And the second is the role of the international community and a Paris Agreement. And in those, I can show you two or three examples of this role of the international community and how since 2050, with the inclusion of France in the agreement, they moreover all other countries can be included in the Paris Agreement, and they are engaged with the change of this perspective and the point of view and action, plan of action to the climate change across or around the Paris Agreement. And the third is the internal legal frames and how we can do change in our societies, in our communities, in our countries. And I can show you some examples of that. Of the implementation, we have this that Michelle Bachelet, personally, I really appreciated her work in the international community, especially because she was one of the first to talking about that and to talking about the especially vulnerabilities from the women's and the girls in the movement. In the movement, migration, and the human trafficking, the climate change effect. While they sleep, wash, bathe, or dress in emergency shelters, tents, or camps, the risk of sexual violence is a tragic reality of their life as a migrants or refugees. Compounding this is the increased danger of human trafficking and child, early, and forced marriage, which women and girls on the move endure. Michelle Bachelet, UN Human Rights Chief. But moreover, she mentioned in the same moment, she mentioned that this will involve ensuring women's leadership in a disaster risk management, providing sufficient financial resources and putting in a place effective monitoring mechanism And it will guarantee that in times of disaster, women have access to healthcare, sexual and reproductive health, support services, shelter, and security. It's important to understand that those words generate an immediately support and addition in around the world for other women that they recognize the woman leadership in those areas, in those topics, and this is really important. And with those introduction, I can show you one of those examples about the women, empower women's and the leadership women's in those areas. And this action is taken yesterday, for example, and was the Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez representative in the Congress, in the USA Congress. 4 years ago, the Green New Deal was called unrealistic. Last year, we fought for the climate action in the area. They fight resulting in the largest piece of climate legislation in American history, their first law, and they fight you, then we win. So before that, let me show you the declaration, of her. Can you see? Can you listen?
A few years ago, when we introduced the Green New Deal, we were told again and again, this is not realistic. This is unreasonable. That this is just a pie in the sky notion, right? But we said, watch us work. That's okay. Watch us work. And as they say, as the adage goes, first they laugh at you, then they fight you, and then we win. And that, in a nutshell, is a big part of what we've experienced over the last couple of years. First, we were called unrealistic. Then, when it came time to the bipartisan infrastructure law and the Inflation Reduction Act, we started to fight. We said we are not going to take crumbs and we're not going to settle for that we need bold, big climate action and we need it now. And that fight resulted in the largest piece of climate legislation in American history. That is because of the coalitions built that are not just supporting the Green New Deal, but supporting all climate action across a broad progressive spectrum. This coalition of grassroots people and everyday people deciding to make this a political priority is why we are getting the results that we're getting today. We said, watch us work.
Well, as you can see, the Alejandra Cortez was one of the representative behind of that act. That act was one of the principal acts in the history of the Americas. So it's one of the examples how you can do advocacy. You can implement it a lot of things, a lot of changes, and I want to highlight. I would like highlight some of the pieces of this speech when she explained about the internal political scenarios about the bipartisan, and it's important to understand these scenarios because we have allies and we have people who don't support at all the climate change, at all the human trafficking, at all the violation of human rights, or even the migration. And we need to build a strong community. We need to meet together with our points, common points, and our common point of view, and start to create a new strategy, a new resilience, and a new conscience about the impacts of the climate change, the impacts of the migration and the human trafficking, to do better things, to do better actions, to cross from the indignation to the actions. And for that reason, I finished with Alejandra Cortez, because she's an example of this resilience. Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez is an example for this resilience, and she fights for the points, even for 4 years or 5 years, because she understands that we have a goals and we have a milestones, and we need to build a good world and a better world for everybody in our future. Thank you so much, and I am open to any kind of questions or the comments. I listen to you.
Thank you, Diego, so much for the awesome presentation. I think it was such an interesting topic, and also to see the interrelation of those. Maybe at first someone can read it and think that it has nothing to do between them, but once you kind of dig deeper and have interest in the topic, it really is something that we can kind of build and work all together. And so, yeah, I invite the audience either to unmute yourself and ask questions, or to write those on the chat. We still have some more minutes with Diego, and so yeah, feel free to jump in and to chime in.
Thank you, Simon. Thank you, Julesi. I tried to highlight the issue about the girls and women like a victim of this relation between migration, climate change, and human trafficking. But moreover, in other hands, try to bring some leadership, women leadership in those areas, and how they can change our public policy. And really, it's really important, especially in those days. In the present, we need those leaderships in any country to create a better world.
Yeah, I know. I really like that. Kind of showing that we're all able to build the change together. And so, for someone that asked about the presentation being shared, yeah, we can send the presentation if they is okay with that. And actually, the recording has the session has been recorded, and we will also be uploading that on our YouTube channel. And actually, Javinda was saying, thank you for the nice presentation. Do you have any undocumented migrations data status?
Yes, Govinda. I have some data about the undocumented migration. We call it irregular migration because it has an irregular status, and that is really related with human trafficking, because the irregular status migration in some countries, they are the predators, the criminals of human trafficking. They use that condition to exploit the people, exploited the victims. So they say, no, I can call the police, or I can deported you, or request to deported you if you don't do anything for a long time, or you don't accept the condition for be exploited. So that is really important, Govinda. I have data. I can share with you in private. Okay.
Perfect. And we actually have another question from Simon that he's asking: how granular is the data that you have on these displaced persons? Do you know ages, educational levels, etc.?
Yes, the internal displacement, you have a report, and in the presentation is called the report. It's internal, the global report, and it's a huge report. And the first country with internal displacement is China, and the second is Philippines, and they have a lot of split of the information between age and gender and all kind of stuff about the internal displacement. But about the migration, international migration, you have the report of IOM, and IOM has all the split about the age, gender, and the others. All the reports are called in the presentation, so you can download, and it's a public information. Thank you so much, Govinda. Govinda is a Humphrey Fellow from Boston University.
Awesome. It's great to always see some familiar faces and friends coming to the sessions. And so, yeah, I mean, for whoever has, like, if someone else has more questions, I think Diego's more than happy to, to answer those. But for whoever is new to the Migration Summit, I'm just going to be sending over here on the chat the agenda. We are having a couple more events today and packed week next week, which is the last one of the Migration Summit. And so I invite you all to join us and build community and continue talking about these very important topics. I see we have another comment here on the chat from Peter. He's stating, "Thank you so much for this important insight. I have come to study climate change as a human rights issue and a disaster that should be recognized to be contributing to large-scale migration. I think I will start including climate change in my training. Thanks so much."
Yes, definitely. We need to study more climate change and support more research and more studies about that, and support more the movement to study climate change in the all areas. All areas.
Yeah, myself, I'm also an activist, about environmental issues, and you were at some point mentioning that at the very beginning of the session. In a sense, we were all migrants at some point, and we will all be migrants if things, if the world continues to go in the path that it's going, either through conflict or through climate change. And so, I mean, it's not a happy thing to say, but I mean, at the same time, we have to be realistic about what's happening too, and the challenges that we have to be working with. So I think it's important to have this conversation going. Thank you, Peter, for the comment. Okay.
And the last but not least, I need to take a picture about this event. Let me take a picture, and if you want to open your cameras to take a picture, if not, it's okay.
You probably need to see most of us. I guess. Oh yeah, a good presentation indeed. Thank you so much.
No, thank you, Peter. Thank you, Govinda. Happy Eid, right? No? Eid, right? Yeah, happy Eid, right? And Federico. Good to see you. Okay. Well, thank you so much.
Everyone, have a great rest of day and weekend ahead. Bye-bye.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you, Diego, for nice presentation.
Thank you, Govinda. Thank you.